Well, welcome back, guys. It's certainly interesting times here in COVID isolation.
Lockdown,
baby. We've had some pretty cool experiences, Simon and I. I have not washed my hair for 3 days.
Yeah, and it shows.
Oh, thanks very much. And you've been getting some man boobs.
What? I've been getting fitter, actually, because I've just come off the back of our March Foot and Mouth Challenge, which is for 31 days. And that 31st day, trust me, is
it's pretty tough. Yeah, but what is it, right? It's,
so you have to give up something that you put in your mouth too frequently. Mine was alcohol for 31 days. And then you have to self-propel for 5K every day. So run, bike, row.
And you very awesomely pulled your calf on like day 2.
Well, I wouldn't quite call it a pull. I'd call it a mild strain. So I had a few days off, and then I started I substituted it with biking.
Yeah, so that's been actually kind of awesome, right? We've gotten this great routine in the evenings. We've been going down to our garage because we're in isolation, and we've been doing a little bit of bike trainer workouts together.
Yeah, it's funny watching Lesley. She's like a caged hamster, right? So when she's used to being outside so much and banging in 25, 35 hours of training a week, and then you suddenly say, okay, you now have a 12 by 12 foot space. Imagine if you put a hamster who's high on cocaine into a confined space with treadmills and hamster toys. And it's literally like watching. I should probably power the house by the frenetic activity that goes on.
But the good news is that I've not been able to drop you.
That's true. When all of our training is stationary, we stay in the same place.
And our computers face each other. I tend to watch romantic comedies. And what are you on? Narcos?
I've been watching Narcos Mexico, and then I'm going on to Ozark after that. My COVID Netflix binging. Welcome to the XTERRA Podcast. XTERRA is a global brand that champions the outdoor endurance enthusiast in their pursuit of relentless adventure. For over 25 years, XTERRA has been the home of authentic race experiences and trail-tested gear for your journey, all to help you live more. I'm your host, Dr. Simon Marshall, a performance psychologist, and I'm here with my co-host and pint-sized wife, Lesley Paterson, a professional triathlete with 5 world titles to her name.
Hey, wait a minute. How come you get to do the intro?
Well, I knew you were going to ask that. Well, it's just that you're kind of hard to understand sometimes.
What, because I'm Scottish?
Well, yeah, sort of.
That is so typical of the bloody English. Oh, whatever, man. So, wherever you're from, if you're a fan of outdoor endurance adventure sports, you've come to the right place. We talk everything from training your body and mind for outdoor shenanigans to gear, expeditions, travel, and culture.
Let's get started.
What's been fascinating during this time, and we don't just want to speak about COVID times, we want to parlay that into sort of how it impacts many mental issues that we deal with. This is almost like a microcosm, right? It's almost like a social study that we're going through right now. But is the sense of uncertainty about our futures.
It's awful.
It is, isn't it? It's kind of
really
weird.
I think, and that's, we've spoken about this in the past, in the context, particularly talking with athletes about uncertainty and what uncertainty does to the human brain. There are a few sort of psychological states, or I should say environments that make the human brain want to crap the bed. And uncertainty is one of those. So an outcome that you're not sure what's going to happen. You're not sure how things are going to turn out.
Obviously, we have uncertainty right now with this pandemic, but you have uncertainty in things like injuries. If you have a race coming up, you don't know when you're going to get over an injury. Uncertainty in relationships sometimes when you're going through bad patches. Isn't that right, darling? No, that's
We're not going through a bad patch, are we?
17.
Am I detecting?
You misreading? No, not at all, darling.
But absolutely. And watching your career, when you've had injuries that have been really difficult to diagnose, like Lyme-related stuff or, chronic fatigue-related stuff.
Right, so more health issues.
Is there an
as well.
answer? Is this it for me now? Will I ever be the same athlete I was? Versus breaking your shoulder or, doing something your wrist. It's has a discrete beginning and end point. But when you don't know the outcome, your brain just does not like that at all.
No.
And I think what's fascinating for me as a, scientist and psychologist for years of working in health environments is helping, usually in my old job, helping patients or helping people with chronic diseases manage uncertainty. Oh my God, if this is what it's going to be like for me now for the rest of my life, oh my word, what will I do? And managing that emotional roller coaster is really difficult. And it's actually a little window to the wiring of the brain, in fact, about why we find those situations so difficult. In the COVID environment, things are a little bit different. I mean, we know it is going to come to an end, but there is uncertainty about, are we going to be infected? Am I going to lose my job? Or how am I going to cope with my income being cut in half or being eradicated?
What's going to happen to my children, their education? Is that going to have a long-term effect? Or, people with mental health disorders, even depression, anxiety, what's the long-term impact of that? Yeah, for sure.
Uncertainty we know has quite a profound effect on the body's immune response, on our emotional life, our emotional world. And for that reason, unlike disappointment, which is far less severe and far less difficult to deal with than uncertainty. And this is one reason why uncertainty is used in psychological warfare. It's been weaponized, right?
Right, for torture.
For torture, solitary confinement, interrogation techniques. It's all leveraging that the body is really, and the brain does really not like not knowing outcome. And the reason for that is much of our hormonal system, our hormonal response, our nervous system responses, our immune system are built around anticipation, right? There's a whole bunch of mechanisms in the brain that change or up and down regulate different hormones, neurotransmitters in the face of thinking about the future. Right. And
so if you don't know the future, then you can't have anticipation. So it sort of down regulates.
It really is. I mean, think of the example for athletes that you're going out on, or you're doing an FTP test, right? A functional threshold power test, the maximum amount of power on a bike you can generate for around 60 minutes. I mean, let's not get into the science of that, but when you ask someone to say, okay, I just want you to go all out as hard as you can, and I'll tell you when you're going to stop.
Right.
That condition is far more anxiety provoking than say, okay, you're going to go for 20 minutes or you're going to go for 60 minutes. I know how long I have to endure something for. In fact, the science of pain tolerance and discomfort tolerance is partly around how hard something feels, but more importantly, how long have I got to endure this for? So
is that why you're so bloody grumpy when I take you out for a bike ride? You don't, and it ends up being longer.
The worst situation for me is we go out on a run and you say, where are we going? Because I'm thinking, okay, the terrain is going to dictate how hard it is or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you said, just run, enjoy it, we'll just do this. That second piece of information, how long or where, or to visualize how it's going to be like, is when I'm denied that, it increases
your anxiety.
And my ability to cope with it. And I think under the conditions at the moment of isolation, we don't know how long they're going to be going on for. This is a bit like the unending FTP test, right?
Right.
And so it's no wonder that the human brain really doesn't like it.
Yeah. And so, what things can be done to address sort of calming down? Yeah. Because ultimately there's certainly at the moment in this environment or in other environments like being injured, being sick, changing relationships, changing jobs, a lot of those uncertainty provoking environments, there's fear and anxiety that come from that. And so, what are the long-term effects of having that fear and anxiety?
Yeah, well, we know, for example, that we can have a chronic elevated levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone under these conditions. So, for example, high levels of uncertainty is going to drive cortisol through the roof. Cortisol, as you know, impacts our sleep, a whole bunch of
inflammation,
a whole bunch of things. So having hormonal or biological responses tied to anticipation of or uncertainty is a key feature of being human, right? We don't actually want to override that to a certain extent because it's keeping us alive. It makes us vigilant. In fact, animals, when they're placed under conditions of high arousal or uncertainty, lack of food or whatever, their response is primarily vigilance. So in other words, they become more alert. This is the classic fight or flight response. But humans have this rather remarkable ability because we have a very well-developed frontal cortex, which is that wrinkly part of our brain at the front that really helps us plan, think through, strategize. What it does is we can do some mental time travel. And this is the killer for us in terms of the managing the discomfort of uncertainty. We're able to project into the future all of these scenarios, many of which are very unlikely to come true.
Right.
But we have the capacity, the mental capacity to do that. So the equipment that makes us both smart and intelligent is also the thing that gives us a lot of anxiety. So humans go through unlike animals which respond with vigilance, humans tend to respond with worry, rumination, excessive reflection, and a whole bunch of things. And so that's the mechanisms that start triggering, and they're made worse if you have underlying conditions where you already do that a lot. For example, if you have what we call high trait anxiety, your car idling speed, if that's a sort of a measure of your level of anxiousness.
Which is interesting, right? Because that's a lot of, you've kind of spoken about this before, our sport of endurance sport, triathlon, long distance running, biking, and so on, attracts.
Yeah, that's right.
There's this right?
It's called a gravitational theory, right? That we gravitate towards certain sports that either help us work through, or they help us experience environments that we like, very cognitively busy environments, or very physically numbing environments, and so on. But absolutely. So as athletes, we might have endurance athletes. If you have higher levels of anxiety to begin with, or you have a mental health condition, you might have depression or some other unknown or diagnosed disorder, then you're even more likely to have these reactions. These reactions even get more exaggerated. And so you can look at some people on Facebook who are just loving social isolation. Okay, they're only 2 weeks in. They might have had no immediate impact on their own health or the health of their loved ones. That experiences could be very different from someone who has lost their job, has had a grandparent die or a parent die, is really worried about what the next three months or 3 weeks holds for them, outside of, the relative trivialness of whether races are going to be on.
Or even if someone has trait anxiety that you're talking about, right? They're going to respond to the situation differently.
Yep.
And, potentially even change, or have damaging behaviors as a consequence.
Yeah. And even before behaviors, right? So, for example, we know that the ends of chromosomes called telomeres that really largely drive the aging process, a bit of a simplification, but drive the aging process. So high levels of uncertainty actually change telomeres. They actually structurally change the ends of our chromosomes, which are determining largely how we age. So we're actually aging quicker, and our body is breaking down quicker in response to these environments. But the ones that fascinate me the most are the psychological responses. I'm not a professional athlete. You are. So you are very also keyed into having a much more predisposed to having a higher immune response. If your immune response is compromised because of the uncertainty, does that have impact for your training and what you can tolerate and so on? For me, who doesn't do that much training, my 5K a day or whatever, it's largely how do I cope with the sort of the rumination, the worry and so on. And I have quite high levels of trait anxiety as well compared to you. So I'm more like to ruminate.
So are there sort of behaviors in terms of whether it's addictive behaviors or things that we might fall back on to cope with this? Or
there are absolutely there are. But before we talk about that, I think one thing that I think is worth mentioning here is, so once we're under periods of high uncertainty. We then get into the business of mental time traveling, anticipation. There are whole areas in the brain, not necessarily you can pinpoint them, but the function of areas of the brain to manage what they call anticipatory anxiety, right? Wow. So different parts of the brain get activated when we start anticipating things that may not be pleasurable, happy, or make us feel good, right? So anticipation is great if you're waiting for Christmas or if you're waiting for your vacation.
Piece of chocolate at the end of the day.
Or a piece of chocolate at the end of the day. But when you're under conditions of unfavorable outcomes, and most of the outcomes under the current environment aren't that pleasant to think about. Okay, we might reconnect with our family families while we're in social isolation, but after a couple of weeks, most people want to murder their children and they want to get a divorce. No, being a bit flippant, but you know what I mean.
But
so
I think,
there's not much good things to look forward to.
No, and specifically for me, I can think back on, say, other circumstances not related to this environment we're in right now. But when I've been injured a couple of years ago, I had a hip stress fracture it was 6 weeks away from the World Championships. And thinking ahead about missing out was the worst emotion. I'd spent all year training for this period of time that I absolutely love, when your body's fit, when you're feeling lean, when you get to go out on all the group rides, when you get to do all the races, when you really get to show, who you are on the racing circuit. And then that's taken away from you. And I think the worst part for me, I remember we were going to Lanzarote with the family, and I had imagined all this wonderful time with my family, doing all these little races out there, doing all this fun training, hanging out with them. And the thought of not having that was absolutely debilitating. And I cried my ever-loving eyes out.
I remember.
Yeah.
And so imagine now if you're an Olympic athlete or Olympic contender. And even though it's been postponed and in the big scheme of things, it doesn't matter that much.
Right.
But in the very here and now world of a professional athlete's head, going into an Olympic year, it's devastating. And there's a guilt associated with it being devastating, right? Because, oh my God, people are dying and people are losing their job. And yet there's this little thing that is somewhat sort of a bit of a luxury. Yes, it's my job. But so, I think having some time to just wallow or let yourself sit with some of those feelings,
because there's a lot of grief and loss.
Oh, there's a huge amount.
And not just in terms of athletic events, but, kids and their proms, people that have had sort of work commitments or big presentations. We've got a very close friend of ours that's a film director. It's her first big film with a major star, and, that's all been shut down, and who knows if it's going to continue. So I think everybody in every different sort of walk of life is dealing with that loss and grief.
So one interesting, maybe interesting to me, I don't know, but interesting I find is a little bit about this biology of this anticipation or the uncertainty. And so most of us are familiar with a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine is sort of largely responsible, I should say largely, we think of it as largely responsible for being the pleasure chemical, right? So when we do something that feels good, it's dopamine that's causing us to feel that way. And there are some behaviors that are universally rewarding, meaning we get a high dopamine response across all species, like sex is one of those. All species.
Sex,
yeah, that's right. Married for 17 years. Like, I remember that. No. It's totally derailed me there. So all species have a dopamine response to universally rewarding behaviors like sex and so on, and food is another thing. But the conditions you're under mutes or changes that reaction, right? So if you are hungry, for example, and you think about food, your dopamine response is greater than if you've just eaten and then you think about food. Or you watch a food show. We've been hooked on this ugly delicious show on Netflix, and my enjoyment of that show varies
depending on what you've eaten for dinner,
whether I've eaten or not. If I watch it hungry, I'm just like salivating. If I watch it after I've eaten, it's okay. The show's not as great, so we get primed, right, to feel a certain way. And so this is a little clue into the role of the actual more recent, because of neuroscientific research about the role of dopamine in reward, and there's implications for this for how we cope with uncertainty. So we get a strong dopamine response when we think about things in the future, right? So when we think about things in the future that are pleasurable, we get a dopamine response. When we're in a deficient state of that thing, if we haven't had food for a long time, if we haven't had sex for a long time, and you think about it, you're going to have a higher dopamine response than if you just had it, and so on. So we do this all the time, but this is now coming to bite us in the butt cheeks in terms of unpleasant things happening. So when we think about unpleasant things happening, outcomes in the current environment, actually what it does is it obviously stimulates a little bit of that fight or flight response. And we talk about the amygdala, the part of your limbic system, your chimp brain that is like the satellite dish for incoming stressors. When the amygdala gets activated, it actually has a direct impact on your dopamine receptivity, right? So it's harder to feel pleasure when you're under conditions of fight or flight.
Wow.
Because dopamine is directly impacted by amygdala activation. So now it's difficult to feel pleasure. So we might, for example, things that we used to really associate with being pleasurable, if we're under conditions of high uncertainty or we're anticipating bad things happening or not great things happening, it's going to be even harder to feel good when the good things do happen.
Yeah, and we're experiencing that a lot in talking to our athletes or friends, right? There's this kind of overall feeling of depressiveness, even, and I hate to use that term because it's people that are, not clinically depressed, but just sort of feeling down, just kind of not wanting to get out of bed, just not happy.
Well, Dr. Kenza Gunter, who we talked to for this show, she's a clinical psychologist. Actually has a really remarkable background. She now works primarily in sport, but she's a clinical psychologist by training, has a master's in forensic psychology.
Oh, wow.
An Atlanta-based therapist. Remarkable. And she's got some quite important insights about the impact on our mental health under these conditions at the moment.
I think one of the primary things that all of us are likely feeling is anxiety and fear, right? I mean, the idea of navigating this constantly changing situation and navigating it with the rest of the world, quite literally. I mean, the magnitude of this situation is one that many of us have never seen. And so to try to maintain some sense of structure and normalcy in the midst of a situation that is filled with so much uncertainty, so many unknowns, and we don't quite know where the end is, right? So it's this feeling of having to manage this situation without a known time limit. I think that's breeding a lot of anxiety and fear in all of us. And I think that's, as humans, we like to have structure. We like to feel like we understand what's going on, have a sense of control. And this situation is really challenging all of that. And to your point about some of those secondary effects that people are trying to manage, I think those are effects that not only are concerning in this moment, but those have the potential to create some very long-term effects that people will have to navigate. I mean, if I think about those who may be losing their jobs, wondering where income is going to come from, those who may be infected with the virus and have to navigate what that reality is of dealing with being sick, or unfortunately for those who have lost their lives, that really then brings up other issues of grief and loss that go with the very real and substantial changes that people may experience as a result of this situation. And so I really do think it's just an extraordinary time that's really characterized by a natural anxiety and fear because so much is unknown and we're all navigating this in real time. So we're all just trying to do the best we can do.
Yeah, so grief and loss, right?
Yeah.
Do you feel much grief and loss at the moment about the loss of your season this year?
Do you know, I think I'm so adaptable now, given I've been in the sport for 27 years. Can you believe that?
Yes.
Yes, you can. I know you've got the lines to prove it on your face. Me, however, I do not. I think it's because I've dealt with so much injury and illness over the last 10 years that I've had everything thrown at me, that now I get into a situation and I just kind of go into, how do I get into the solution? How do I form a strategy to help me get through this?
Decision making, right? That's, I guess, the time for it.
Yeah.
But so when we try and make decisions about how to cope with things, what to do next, or you're just trying to project into the future about scenarios so that you can start planning, all of these responses are an attempt to reduce anxiety, right? Mm-hmm. We've got this anticipatory anxiety mechanism. We think about the future. If some of those things aren't really pleasant to think about, those outcomes, we get anxiety, we get rumination, we start worrying about it. And your brain doesn't like that at all. There are whole mechanisms in the brain. One of those is called coping with cognitive dissonance. And all that means is that when you have dissonant thoughts, opposing thoughts, I do this, but I shouldn't, right? I drink too much, I really shouldn't. That's probably a poor example for me. I should do more exercise, but I don't. Or I should want to be more.
I should stretch more.
Your brain, when it has to hold competing or oppositional thoughts, does some remarkable acrobatics to try and restore the equilibrium, right? So on the one hand, you'd think, well, if I just have facts, truths that would help allay my anxiety or fear. So if I have anxiety about catching the COVID-19 or about staying socially isolated or staying at home for another 4 weeks or another 6 weeks, my brain doesn't really like doing that. So what I'm going to do is to reduce that anxiety, we're going to use a coping mechanism. And the brain has a bunch of different coping mechanisms, and we'll talk about some of those in a moment. But they're all designed to reduce anxiety that really are contributed by having this cognitive dissonance, your brain not liking it. So if I'm faced with uncertainty about will I catch it, are these the symptoms, have I got it, we try and find facts and truth, right, to try and confront those. But interestingly, if that doesn't fit, if those facts or truth don't sit with your existing worldview or your belief about how the world works and what people are like, instead of like changing your mind, which would be the adult human sensible thing to do, most humans, they actually become more entrenched in their existing opinions or beliefs, right? Mm-hmm. Because we're just trying to make one side of those two oppositional forces win, right? Because we don't like the anxiety. So this is why when we say, well, and you've got to look at our political landscape at the moment, we're looking often at the same fact, if you want to air quote fact, and two people, sensible,
have a completely different
take on it, because each of us are trying to force it into our own worldview.
Beliefs,
yeah. So I think that has implications for how we're coping with the current crisis, right? So if I have a little bit higher anxiety generally, I'm going to have more anticipation anxiety. Right. I'm going to probably be more likely to go down rabbit holes of worst case scenarios, whereas someone who is a bit more easy going may not do those things as much.
Well, it's really interesting to see specifically how our athletes have been dealing with this situation, how different people deal with uncertainty or obstacles. They either choose to kind of take it and utilize, which we might come back to, a sense of a growth mindset. How can I take these circumstances and make myself better because of them? So getting into the solution. Or am I going to get bogged down and kind of ruminate over it and, everything's ruined. Everything's falling apart.
Yeah,
so we really have a split. Yeah, catastrophizing. Right? So we've really got a split going on in our athletes right now.
And having to work at home right now, dealing with one of the common themes of the people that we've been dealing with, and me especially professionally, helping people manage their reactions to this, has been, okay, I'm now at home, and how do I stay productive? And how do I stay sort of on task and disciplined? Mm-hmm. And whilst that's great, we want to be able to do that, and we've got some ideas about how to do that. I think one part is about rethinking what actually the environment we're in and why we're in that situation.
So one thing Dr. Gunter said is that we have to be more compassionate towards ourselves.
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind when I hear that is I think we need to have a bit more compassion towards ourselves. I saw something yesterday on Twitter, and I apologize that I don't have the direct reference for it, but the sentiment basically was, we keep saying working from home, but in reality, we are all staying at home in order to maintain our safety in the middle of a global pandemic and still trying to work, right? Because this notion of working from home might suggest that we all chose to stop going into our respective offices and just work from the comfort of our homes, but that's not what's happening. And so I think when I saw that, I said, that's a really good perspective shift to remind us all that having a bit more compassion, because we all are managing something, right? We all are trying to navigate this crisis. And so when it comes to motivation, I think having compassion toward yourself, I think managing our expectations is really important. I don't know if it's a realistic expectation to think that I am going to be as productive at home in this situation, in this crisis situation, as I would be going to the office. One of the things that I've noticed for myself is I feel like I'm working harder at home because quite literally I could be working from the time I wake up until the time I go to bed with very little break in between. And that's very different than what my work life would be like if I were going to an office. Those natural transition points that might occur if I were commuting from home to the office, or if I might get up from my office and walk down the hall and speak to a colleague for 15 minutes. That natural break is not present right now in my quote unquote work environment, right? My dining room table is my office. and my dining room table and where I sometimes sit and watch TV, right? It's all in one. And so those natural breaks in the day, those natural transition points that allow us time to move from a work mindset to a more relaxed mindset of being at home, we don't have those. So we have to be really intentional about building that in and designating some work time and stepping away from work in the same way that we have to monitor how much information we're taking in. I think it's really important for us to schedule breaks in our day to allow for us to have some distance from our work, even though we are at home.
Yeah, she's right. I really need to be kind to myself because sometimes I'm just, hitting myself over the head with a hammer all the time, saying I'm not good enough, I need to do more. And it's just so fascinating to see how different people are coping with this specific situation and other obstacles like this in general.
Yeah, well, your coping skills are quite different than mine.
Oh, yeah.
I think you're a real. So in psychology, there are two types of stress management or coping styles, as we call them. One is we refer to as a problem-focused coping, and the other is called emotion-focused coping. We all do both, but we tend to gravitate to one more than the other. So a problem-focused coping method, when there's a stressor, something from the outside, it doesn't have to be like physically on the outside. It could be just a thought that nags away at us. But one of the mechanisms that we often use is to try and make that stressor as small as possible, right?
Yep.
So we target, so this is I've got a lot of work on, I'm stressed. What's a problem-focused coping? I'm going to work harder and longer hours. Right. I'm making the stressor go down. I'm actually tangibly focusing on getting the in tray as low and as empty as possible, right? Task-focused coping. In sport, task focus, I'm scared of, an open water swim start with big waves.
So I'm going to go out in the waves all the time.
I'm going to learn how I'm going to be a better open water swimmer. So problem focused coping. You're making the problem lower or less. Now, and we all do that to a certain extent. The other method that people use is called emotion focus. Now, this is now just changing the filter. So I'm not changing at all the size or the significance of the stressor itself at source. I'm just changing with how I frame it or interpret it. So this is where like meditation fits in. This is where talking things through fits in, right? You're not actually changing anything. And actually, this is a little bit of a cliche in the way men and women tend to, the old cliche about, I don't want you to solve my problems. I just want you to listen to them, right? One person is coming in with a problem-focused coping. You're saying you're having a problem with this. Let's try and what can we do to reduce it? Whereas they're saying, I don't want to do anything. I just want to just talk it through. That really underlying that argument is actually that one's using a problem-focused, one's using a emotion-focused coping method. So
how does that work with me then? So I think you'll find that I'm the doer and you're the moaner. No, you're
the thinker.
You're the girl and I'm the boy in the relationship.
Well, let's not go there. But I do think that we all use both. But the great lesson we've learned from high performance folks is that the best people do both. Right. And this is why, in Stress Management 101 is you start off with this stress audit, right? Okay, what are the strategies I currently use? Good warts and all, right, to cope with anxiety about the future. One might be, I'm going to do more exercise, right? I'm going to get into a routine so that I make sure that I always do a little bit of this every day. That might be problem-focused methods, right? Because I'm making sure that I'm still getting work done, I'm still entertaining and educating my children and all the things that are making those things. But the emotion-focused coping might be very healthy. Some of it might be a little bit more exercise. I can just feel as though I get some separation from it. But some of it might not be, right? Eating, drinking too much. I noticed, you telling me about Mexico City and selling alcohol now?
Yeah, so in Mexico City, I believe they have stopped selling alcohol from certain times, or certainly not as available because they're worried about people, developing drinking habits.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, those emotionally, all of those things like overeating, or eating just bad stuff, drinking a lot, watching porn,
a lot, just
whatever. They're all what we call a little subcategory, emotionally avoidant coping. So now you're not actually changing the filter, how you frame things. You're just numbing yourself to it, right? You're making yourself feel a bit better. But of course, out the long term, you're making yourself worse because obviously those methods don't actually do much to solve the problem.
So, I mean, some of the I won't even call it bad behavior. That sounds terrible, but this addiction to information overload, certainly in this environment. I know I've been addicted to that kind of information, whether it's looking up injuries, how to solve them, how to fix them, health issues, how to solve them, how to fix them. So, social media, the impact of that on our system.
Yeah, so you use social media, or at least, the interwebs, for largely as a problem-focused coping tool, right? To find more about the symptoms that you have or treatments that might work or be effective.
Other people have had, issues the same as mine, forms of empathy with those people, that sense of community by finding other people that have had issues with it. But yeah, essentially trying to get to the bottom of why I have what I have and how to fix it.
But that I think is the sort of the double-edged sword of the internet or social media, right? Because on the one hand, it's a strategy or technique for doing problem-focused coping.
Right.
We can learn emotion-focused coping tools. I can learn meditation. I can read, calming mantras or something. But it also is that you get caught up in what other people are doing, how they're coping.
Yep, the hysteria.
The social comparison to it. And social media, it has such a remarkable impact on our sort of physical and psychological well-being.
Yeah. It really is such a different landscape now compared to bygone eras before.
Well, listen to Dr. Gina Merchant talk a little bit about this. So Dr. Merchant, she works primarily in sort of psychology, the interface of psychology and health, but with particular emphasis on social networks and how social media affects us.
It's an interesting question because historically the research in social media and health has focused on total time spent. And that is really an inappropriate approximation of the effect that using social media has on one's health. So the research has grown a lot over the last 5 years. And what we're starting to see is it's really about what you're doing while you're using social media. So for example, a lot of the younger, tweens, teenagers, and adults as well, but really the younger populations, spending a lot of time focusing on the development of their sense of self and publishing photos and content that they are waiting for social approval of others. And that type of engagement with social media can be really damaging. Because if you think about when we were young, obviously there was always pictures. We always had in the back of our head wondering what other people thought of us. The way that got memorialized was not forever. And so what the research is showing is that the long-term damage as people are trying to go through the self-discovery process when they're younger is a big problem. So I guess that is probably the most concerning as I look at kind of future generations growing up in a social media environment. I do think a positive for the younger adults and the teenagers is that there is such a expansive reach, right? So we live in a global society, but it is definitely more true now than ever that, young children and teenagers growing up in India can get exposed to different cultural influences and share with peers that live somewhere, in a completely different country across the globe. And then I would say for the older populations, middle-aged to older adults, what we're finding is it can be this vortex of our attention spans. And that takes away from other opportunities to engage face to face. And it also burrows us into these silos where I think that the internet and social media is going to give me exposure to new ways of thinking. But what actually ends up happening is that I have opinions politically or otherwise, and I start to engage with people in social media environments. And instead of expanding my worldview, I tend to become further entrenched in what I already believe. And then the last thing I'd say to end on a positive note is that for the older adult populations, it really is a new medium. And so when we think about the opportunity to connect with others and people that we might like grandchildren or just people that we used to fraternize with, but we haven't seen for years and years, it does open up those opportunities in a way that's never been experienced before, in the history of humankind.
So social media is such a fascinating thing, and it's so pervasive in our society and how we operate nowadays. And in fact, every evening, you'll be interested to hear this, after dinner, no, in fact, it's before dinner, Simon loves to go to the bathroom for quote unquote a pee, in which he
Play Scrabble.
He plays Scrabble, but he also gets on Facebook. He also trolls through social media.
I'm sorry, but women still do not understand the role that the toilet plays for men. It harks back to the.
Yes. Okay, whatever. So anyway, yeah, it's just fascinating. I think, you know, how we consume it, when we consume it, like what that tells us about our personality, who we are, and how it then impacts our behaviors and who we are, right?
You mean whether you're a lurker or a stalker or a content sort of adder? It's interesting though, isn't it, how we use it? Like there are some things that you, like Instagram, for example, I don't even have an Instagram account. You've got one, and so I can look through your account just to see what other people are doing, but I don't contribute anything.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I'll spend a good amount of time in the morning as I have my coffee just seeing what people are doing. I either get inspired by it, I get frustrated by it, I feel negative by it. There's so many different emotions depending on what types of posts are coming through my feed at any given time.
But what about how you use social media as it affects your health?
So let's see what the doctor thinks.
When we think about the ways that we can engage with the technology, you can produce content. So that might be a blog post, that might be a video, TikTok video. You can also engage producing content that's responsive to other people's content. So if you post a video, I start to comment or like, those are all digital traces that are me actively engaging in a way that, you know, a researcher or others can see. Now, I can also engage with the content in a way that's not visible to others. So I can go in and start to view, you know, someone's Instagram feed, if it's public, even if I'm not friends with them. And then I can start to click on pictures because they've tagged people. And what we know about the way, you know, humans are very drawn to novelty. And we're also drawn to these aspirational things, right? Marketers capitalize on this everywhere. And so it can be a very dangerous exercise once I'm in that online immersive environment to just keep going. A good example of this is the do-it-yourself videos for like woodworking or cooking shows. There's been some really interesting research around people who don't go actually do these activities themselves, but instead spend hours and hours and hours watching other people do the activities. And interestingly, that gives people, if you ask them to rate their confidence in their ability to do these tasks. So I start watching cooking videos. Somebody asks me my confidence in able to bake this cake. I would rate myself as very capable. But yet, if you actually ask me to go bake the cake, I haven't really learned how to bake a cake because I've just been watching someone else do it. So we give ourselves a false sense. In this context, I'm talking about like my skill acquisition. And I think the tragedy really lies in the fact that I'm not going out in the real world and doing these things. I'm just giving my sense of self this illusion that I am acquiring a new skill or I'm somehow benefiting from my time spent with this technology.
What do you think about that in a sporting context? So now, you know, watching lots of videos about how to do XYZ,
right,
versus actually making yourself better at doing them.
So I think people spend so much time doing that. One, they maybe think they're an expert when they're not. But two, it almost makes them feel like they're doing their sport instead of maybe focusing on the foundational things, on just getting the work done. And so it's almost like this kind of weird substitute in a way for actually doing the work. At least that's what I've experienced.
Yeah, I mean, some of the exercise videos are you're actually going alongside and doing them, right? You're not like watching a 10-second video on how to make a cake. You're actually going alongside them. But looking at it in things like Zwift, right, which is kind of a social media exercise as well, right? You're like social comparison, how do you stack up? And there's now, of course, and not to target just Zwift, you know, any online like social comparison group exercise format where we can still get the competitive juices out. Do you think, is that going to have a negative effect on us? Could you do too much
of it? Well, I think you almost isolate yourself by doing some of that stuff. I mean, so many people are doing Zwift instead of maybe going out socially with other groups or interacting. Not at the moment, but I mean, it's different in this scenario than it is in everyday life. But if we're talking about sort of non-COVID times, I think there's almost too much social comparison, right? And
I think so. I think that's actually one of the things that I'm most concerned about. If we become not obsessive, but if we immerse ourselves in virtual experiences, I'm now going to do a daily boot camp online, like follow along, or I'm going to Zwift now 4 times a week or 5 times a week, and you're not doing we can't physically do anything else. Then you also all of those environments are still. They're still sort of quite curated as far as the content provider, right? And we know this because we've done our 6-minute 6-pack video. Yes, it's 6 minutes of doing these core exercises, but there's 20 takes for each one.
To make them look perfect.
Yeah, to make them look perfect. And when you're doing them, you're thinking, oh my God, why can't I do this for a minute? Or why can't I get this exercise? What you're looking on screen looks so simple, right? Because it's been edited down like that. And it's the same with Zwift. Unfortunately, in environments like the online racing or training, is that the ability to manipulate information. I mean, the number of times that people are in Zwift meetups or races and you look at their watts per kilo, make them a world tour rider. Like, really? You're either lying about your FTP or you're lying about your weight. And I imagine, weight doping is probably the easiest one to do, right?
Which is super interesting because that leads then into that sense of impression management. How we project who we want to be seen as in the world. Yeah. And by doing a lot of these things in social media, online, we can kind of curate that information about how people view us, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a natural tendency for the human mind to want to shape other people's perceptions of ourselves. That's really what impression management, we're trying to manage other people's impressions of you. And in the real world, we do that by the way that we interact, right? Interpersonally, or when we speak to people on the phone or something like that. But most of those environments are they can't be edited down, right? No amount of editing is going to change your ability to speak in person for 1 minute about something or have someone make an impression of you. But in a virtual world, of course, you can do that. And so what we're looking at is the Heisman Trophy reel of people's lives on social media. And this might extend to Zwift and online boot camps and all the other things as well, right? Because our brain is craving, where do I sit in the social hierarchy of things, or even a fitness hierarchy? When you're confronted with new information, human brain, first thing, what does this mean? And the second question it asks, is this any good, right? So we want to know. We're constantly comparing ourselves to others, and that's healthy. We never, I don't buy all these we talked about this in our book quite a lot. I don't buy into these memes about comparison is the thief of joy, and it's nonsense. You're going to compare yourself. Your brain is biologically wired and will hit you over the head until you do it, because it helps us understand where we sit in the world, right? Physically, intellectually, aesthetically, and that in years gone by, hundreds of thousands of years, determined whether we lived or died. But now it really doesn't. So we're left with this sense of, inferiority, or I'm not as good. And I wonder if that extends to how we cope with COVID-19, the social isolation, right?
Right, but can you have too much of that comparison? Can it have a detrimental effect on, who you are if you spend all this time just comparing to other people and stop focusing on yourself and your own journey, and you're always looking at others for a way to determine your own happiness? Surely that's going to have a consequence.
An individual's vulnerability, right, to how the negative impact of these sorts of things will influence you differently based on how vulnerable we are, based on certain emotional or psychological states that you have.
So do you think there's some kind of moral obligation that we have when we're posting, when we're interacting on social media, about what we say, who we say it to, how we're projecting ourselves, how we're commenting on other people, because it has such an influence now?
Yeah, I think we do. It depends on how, how much you reflect about your responsibilities about what this is for. But I think most of us are so caught up in the in the impression management porn, which is Facebook and Insta and Snap and even TikTok now, that our brains are so wired to just look for things that make us feel good, sort of one eye open at things that make us not feel so good, but we still can't help looking at them because it reinforces where we're positioned. I think the bigger question is, do the social media companies have a responsibility to post? And I think this is where some of the experts might be able to wade in.
No, I absolutely think there's a moral responsibility. And I know this gets debated a lot in, mainstream news and media. But I think we need to adopt a very similar approach that we do with public policy around other public health issues. So if, I'm taking my neighbor's kid to Disneyland, I have a legal responsibility to seatbelt that child in the correct car seat or what have you. And I think the similar thing holds true for information around vaccines and other health issues. It's a convenient response, in my opinion, that the large social media companies like to put the burden on the user. And we know from, again, information processing and just the sheer volume, it isn't the case that the human is incapable at a fundamental level of learning or making the right health decision were they to be presented with the right information. It's the case that the information is presented so quickly and there's so much of it. And so, yes, I think the other example when it comes to elections and COVID-19, as a society, we make a decision about what is truth, and we hold journalists and publications of major newspapers to a certain standard so that, civil wars don't break out, so that the public is protected. And we're seeing the effects of that not happening on platforms like Facebook. So Russia was able to come in and wage a, digital war essentially against our democracy. And all of a sudden, we don't have a responsibility to protect society. I feel like it's a convenient response because it's a hard problem to solve for, but we're just not facing it with the level of seriousness and gravity that it deserves.
So clearly we're personally responsible for our own relationship with social media, right? I mean, it could be a while before we get tools coming down the pipe from the social media companies to manage and curate that for us, that's giving us trustworthy news and blah, blah, all the other stuff. Mm-hmm. But until then, it's probably up to us, right?
Well, we can choose to turn the television off. We can choose to have times where we don't look through social media, or we can take ourselves off it. Right?
Sure, but social media, you got to remember that these systems like Snap and TikTok and Facebook and Insta, they're wired, they're built to sort of hack into the brain's dopamine reward system, right? These, for example, if you have one of the things that we know, for example, in reward, anticipation, we've talked about that already, but if you know exactly what you're going to get, the reward and when, it's less, you get a lower dopamine response than if you're slightly uncertain, right? So novelty in a reward, but you know it's going to be positive, but there's novelty in it, has a much more powerful reward effect than knowing exactly what you're going to get. This is why people, will play the slot machines to throw out money, right? It's this time, this pull of the one-armed bandit that's going to be my winning streak. Is that sort of, they call it a variable reinforcement schedule, which is most rewarding. And that's how social media gets us, because, you never know what you're going to see, right? That's the great thing. You get the little notification, or someone's mentioned you in a post, or you go onto TikTok or whatever, and you'll see, who knows? You just know it's going to be enjoyable, pleasant, humorous, sometimes depressing content, but it's a mixed bag. And that's why it's so powerful. So trying to override our brain's craving for that, and it's built with knowing what those biological craving mechanisms are, is really difficult, right? Other than say, take your phone away from you, or how do I actually what are the strategies I can be a little bit more parental over myself about it?
It's important to take a break. So I recently, anecdotally, but I actually was motivated and inspired by others I have a friend who has struggled with a lot of mental health issues, and she did what you said. So she uninstalled Instagram and does not have an account anymore. So for me, I didn't want to do that because I didn't feel it was that addictive and I was in that bad of a spot. But I did take it off of my phone for 30 days and I didn't use it. And what that enabled me to do was once I decided, okay, 30 days are up, I'm going to re-engage with the platform. I just had I had a much higher level of awareness of how much time I was spending on the site. And I also think that the time away allows you to open your eyes and stop having this tunnel vision about your own world, right? You just, by sheer nature of not literally having your face shoved into the screen, can see the world around you from a different perspective. I also think Instagram, TikTok, and these ones where they're very heavily oriented towards contributing rich content like photos and videos, you no longer feel compelled to be in your habitat, so to speak, and recording what's happening and then publishing that so that others can view it. And instead, you just immerse yourself in what is happening around you, and that gets held onto as a memory, which again was the way that all of us experienced the world before social media came around.
Okay, so I mean, I definitely have my strategies to move away from the impacts of things like social media. I turn the programs off for short periods of time. I don't look at them. I take my phone away. I put it on airplane mode.
You asked me not to mention certain competitors.
I do, as I'm coming up to races, right? A lot of athletes do this. They turn it off and they'll not engage and they'll put out a little word saying, I'm not going to be on social media for the next week. And I think, ultimately, it's about creating a platform, creating an arena where we can make ourselves more mentally resilient to all of the influences around us, and especially given this kind of time, right, where where brains are under a lot of stress.
Right. I think in the physical equivalent here is we talk about FDP a lot, and even though it's not the time to go into the limitations of that. But as a general rule, we say, okay, if I know my functional threshold power is such a key part of my whether I can persist and do this and reach a goal, psychologically or emotionally, what's the equivalent mentally, right? What's my brain FDP, or what's my emotional or psychological sort of fitness? Mm-hmm. And there have been some attempts to try and figure that out. I know that a lot of the training platforms, Training Peaks, Today's Plan, and a few others are always trying to include metrics of like subjective well-being, and hopefully to convert those into like quantifiable scores, so you can see just like we would do on all the other training metrics. But some of the psychologists have identified a few key traits that seem to be the hallmark of the closest thing to a brain FDP. And they call it actually psychological capacity, or psych cap. And really what that, and some of this research literature is a little bit contentious. It comes out of a field in psychology called positive psychology, which is also a contentious area of study for reasons so that we don't need to talk about here. But there are some elements in there that I think are really noteworthy. And one of those is that psychological capacity, resilience, if you want to, well, it's not actually resilience, but the ability to be, what skills, mental and emotional skills do I need to be mentally healthy and robust in a uncertain environment? Maybe that's the way of putting it. The first one is hope, right? Hope is one of the 4 key elements of psychological capacity. And hope is really about, yes, it's about thinking that there's something positive down the line coming, but what really separates the capacity part is your role in that process. So in other words, where, for example, hope differs from optimism is a second element of psychological capacity. I just have a positive outlook. I have a general sense that things are going to turn out okay, which is optimism, which is important to have. And there's a whole bunch of studies that show that you're, and
not you.
Yeah, are you a half full or a half empty person? And healthy levels of optimism help your immune system, psychological well-being, blah, 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 all that. But where hope differs is that it puts you in a central place in having that positive outcome. I can be completely optimistic about the future, but absolutely do nothing about it. Just let the future happen and it'll turn out the way it turns out. But with hope, it puts you front and center. So what are you actually going to do about it to be able to have the outcome that you want, which is why it's an important part of psych cap, right? So it would be, okay, I want to come out of all this, still have some fitness, still having, a job. I still have things that make me happy and confident and enjoy life. So what actually can I do to make sure some of those things, and this is where problem-focused coping comes in, right? Laying the seeds or the groundwork for this happening again.
Well, what have you seen me do from an athletic standpoint? I've used this time because, I'm effectively working out in the garage. I am mastering all those tiny little exercises, attention to detail on glute engagement, form application, core, stretching. I'm doing all those little things that normally I would just push aside and not focus on. So I'm utilizing this time to create hope that I can be a stronger, less injured and, better performing athlete in the future.
So in that example, you've got willpower, which is the motivation to want to do it, but you've got the way power as well. You actually go down to the garage and you do these exercises routinely, whereas I probably don't as much. So that ability to set goals and to be smart goals and so on is really important. What a little quirk of some of the psychological research about how goals are best translated into action is really, I find really fascinating. It might just be me that finds this interesting. So one of the problems we found is the relationship between intention, statements of I will, I plan to, I'm going to, and action, do you actually do it, is very small, right? So in statistical terms, the correlation is about 0.2. And if you don't know anything about statistics, just know that the relationship, once I know what you tell me you're going to do, it doesn't really predict that much whether you're actually going to do it. And we're all filled with good intentions, right?
Sure.
But one of the things that helps us convert intentions into action, in fact, we can almost double the strength of that relationship, is by setting what psychologists call implementation intentions, which are just, how am I going to implement this thing? Like, okay, on Thursday at 8 a.m., I'm going to go and do my elliptical down in the gym or down
so
in the
making sure that everything is ready to go, right? The elliptical's
everything's
plugged
ready to go.
in, the machinery is working.
That's one of the take-home lessons from the research. Right. One of the others that has received less attention comes from a woman called Dr. Gabrielle Oettingen, who's a psychologist, and she found that when we spend a lot of time wishing about in this intention phase, your vision board is a great example of a wish, sort of all the intention that you want to do. If we get so fixated on those, actually it reduces our tendency to actually be able to do it. It's totally counterintuitive. Wow. So being a visionary and thinking about all the great things you want to do, and if you spend a lot of time doing that, it's actually undermining your ability to actually convert it. So what she found is that when you do something called mental contrasting with these implementation intentions, that's a word salad. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, what that means is that instead of focusing on the goal of how I'm going to do X on a Thursday morning at 8 a.m., you focus on the biggest obstacles to the goal, right?
Oh, right.
So instead of now focusing on, okay, I've now set my, I'm going to do 5 minutes on the treadmill at 8 a.m. on Thursday morning, instead of just becoming fixated on making sure, 8 a.m., I've got my running shoes, what you actually do is say, think through the most likely or biggest obstacles for you doing that, right? And it might, and some examples might be, well, I had a really late night and I drunk 3 glasses of wine and I just felt a bit groggy in the morning and I just couldn't be bothered. I just put it off.
Yeah, or the gear's packed away at the back of the garage and it's not accessible, or you don't have the right band to use on your knees to do the exercise.
For some reason at 7 a.m. they're up and awake and around and driving me bananas and I just can't do it. So you then set goals around reducing the obstacles.
Oh, interesting.
So now you say, okay, and you have to do a little what they call a pre-mortem, right?
How are you going to get it done?
To anticipate it getting derailed, what are the things that derailed it? Okay. Come up with 3, and then focus on how I deal with those situations. So when we try and get people to stop smoking or cut down drinking, that's actually a hallmark of treatment. You say, okay, it's not so much summoning and building motivation and willpower about why I should stop and the health benefits. You're saying, okay, you're now at dinner with everybody and you step outside, 3 people step outside of your closest friends who smoke, and you've just eaten, and it's a strong social cue for you to smoke. What are you going to do when someone offers you a cigarette or offers you a drink at a party and you're trying to stay away?
Right.
That's what you set goals around. So you practice like saying how to say no or how to conceal that you're not doing something. You're a good example of this. Remember drinking in college where you have a lot of pressure to drink?
Yeah, in college. I mean, in Scotland, especially drinking alcohol, it's just what you do. And I was kind of ostracized for not doing it. So I had to kind of pretend.
Yeah, you fill up an empty beer bottle with water and no one, if you've got a bottle in your hand or a drink that looks like,
so
I hope you didn't say vodka in a beer bottle, but I know what you mean. So, but that technique of setting barriers around goals is a great strategy to improve your ability to have hope. That's the second capacity in SightCap. The third one is what we call efficacy or confidence, right? Mm-hmm. And we've said this time and time again, and this is my mantra as a sports psychologist is, listen, if you do nothing else with your time, athletes who are confident, it's like a magic sword, right? It's like a special thing that you have, and the science of confidence is long and complicated. But building opportunities to feel as though you're successful, and unfortunately, all the research says you can't learn confidence; you can only earn it. Right. So you have to have tried things that are difficult, failed, got back up, and then pulled it off and stuck with it long enough so that you've got through it. This is where that growth mindset fits in.
So this is where, and certainly in my training specifically, I focus very much on the process of things, because I used to go to sessions, whether it was group rides or maybe it was a track session where my coach wanted me to hit certain numbers. And if I didn't hit those numbers, it felt like a failure, like I had not succeeded. And so my confidence got lower and lower and lower. And I started in the sport in ITU racing, where swimming was everything. I kept on coming out the water last. Everything was a failure. And I wasn't focusing on the things that I was good at enough to give me enough confidence to get the stuff that I was bad at better. Right. And so what I had to do is really break everything down so that every single session that I ever do, there's process goals in there so that I'm always going to have some kind of success. So even if I don't hit the numbers, even if I don't get the right power zone, even if I get dropped from the group, there's certain aspects of that session that I come away with feeling like I'm confident because I've been successful in them. And so you really have to break it down bit by bit and, have and it's not just in sport. It's in business, it's in relationships, all the little things that you feel you are good at need to mount up enough to give you the confidence that you can get through the challenges.
And I think that lesson is that you can spend too much time focusing on your weaknesses, right? Because you forget what strengths you have. Totally. And the strengths and successes is what builds your confidence.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, during these times that we're in right now, where we are isolated, and people are struggling to sort of deal with that, uncertainty, they're kind of falling down the rabbit hole, they're giving up, they're not having hope, they're not having goals, they're not feeling successful. I mean, what are some of the main strategies to deal with that kind of
so I think this ties into the fourth element of psychological capacity, which is resilience, right? The ability to bounce back up or cope with adversity. Right. And we know that all of these elements are interrelated, right? The more confidence you have, the more likely you are to be able to stand up and persist and try things again. But the resilience, the ability to find sort of to face reality. But I think critically, it's about finding meaning, right? So when you're in what is essentially often feels like a fairly hopeless, unknowable situation about how it's going to turn out, you have to find ways to get meaning out of the things that you're doing at the moment. Mm-hmm. And meaning, and I use meaning in a fairly in a big philosophical way. What's the point of all this? And athletes, if there's one common theme we've known, that races may not be on for the rest of the year. What's the point of training anymore? You have to have those why questions answered in your own head. You have to know why you're doing it. And like, for example, athletes, you love training and racing is icing on the cake for the training. But fundamentally, you love training. If all I do is I love competing and I'm only training because it helps me race, psychologically, I'm really vulnerable in situations like now.
Right. And especially if you get injured or get sick or there's something else that derails you being able to race. Right. And then you have to ask the bigger questions of why is it that racing is what fulfills me? I know my why to this. I love to be in nature. I love to master a craft. I love to push the limits. There's a lot of different things that make my why. Yeah. But I think in order to fulfill the whys during this time, I have had to purposefully drill down on creating certainty within this uncertainty. And that certainty for me has been about creating a routine, because that routine is going to help me continue to fulfill my why. So the structure for me as, okay, what equipment do I have access to? Where can I go that I'm allowed to go with? Can I train with anyone? Can I not? Am I allowed to go outside? Am I not? What are the variables here? And let me create a structure and routine around that to give me certainty.
Yeah, and I think that really ties into the sort of the hallmark of coping, bring it full circle, right? Which is the antidote is structure, routine, and reward. Right. Remember, uncertainty is an anticipation biological mechanism, and we are struggling because we don't have control. So it makes total sense that the brain's effort to combat that would be based around managing control, right? So what can I control? And I can control what I do at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning and how long I do it for. I can control when I switch tasks. I can control what I put in my mouth, how I exercise, and so on. So the more we have those in our life is really the perfect antidote to when you're in highly uncertain environments. And
especially, people are working from home right now, or, hey, even when I've been injured, I've said, okay, what exercise can I do to make me feel like I'm still progressing, that I'm still fulfilling a lot of these things that I need in my whys? And it's the same here in terms of creating that structure. So really in this phase of being at home, I've just sat down and I've written out big lists. Okay, what time am I getting up? When am I going to work out? What exactly is the session? And that has really helped me cope with this scenario, I think, way better than others. And we've tried to do this for our athletes, right?
Absolutely. I think the purpose piece, though, this bigger existential philosophical question, still, none of us do a very good job of it, or most of us don't do a good job of it. So yes, we can have structure in our lives. We can put more routine. I can go through the motions of doing X at a certain time. But what about looking for opportunities to notice places to get meaning and satisfaction out of your life that you perhaps just when you're on a train that's 100 miles an hour as normal pace of life is, and when you're forced to slow down, then what do you start noticing? And
it's so interesting. I've had some great conversations with some of my best friends here, and they say, I hate to say this, but during this specific isolation time, I've actually enjoyed it because it's allowed me to get off the train and to spend time doing things that I've always wanted to do. Hang that picture, do a drawing, do more cooking, spend more time with my family, get on the phone with my family more, just hang out more.
I mean, that is still a fairly privileged position because much of the world is
lost
not just
jobs. They're sick.
They're losing lives. They're losing income, and it is a lot more serious. But for those of us who are, we can get through a few months on a less income. We can cope with being inside. I think opportunities to start noticing things that otherwise would have passed you by. And in fact, that's one of the really fascinating findings from the study of the psychological research on happiness and passion. Mm-hmm. The research shows that passion and happiness, or I should say noticing things to be happy about, it becomes a skill of not looking for stuff, but noticing it, right? The science of happiness and passion tells us that the breadcrumbs are already around you about what you can. So what is it that we can look for in our home environment? It can be, practicing a little bit more on a musical instrument. It could be actually, well, you know what? I've actually connected with people far more than I would have done outside of isolation, because now we're having... We had a Zoom dinner
date last night with a friend,
right?
Super fun.
That we wouldn't usually have done, or we might have gone over there, but infrequently.
So what have you noticed about me?
In terms of what?
I don't know. Am I farting less? I don't know.
Well, you're very industrious. You like the little caged hamster. You're frenetic and frantic. I think your biggest challenge. And I'll tell you what mine is in a moment. Your biggest challenge is learning to sit with nothing, right? Yeah. Learning to sit with yourself.
Yeah.
Your mum has this.
Yep.
Some of your sisters one of your sisters has this, especially. I think it's learning to be able to be left alone long enough, like the frenetic pace of life. And maybe, I don't want to sort of try and guess at what the reasons for that are, but learning to be more at one with just sitting and not doing anything, right? Just with your own thoughts.
Right, what's yours then? Come on, spit it out.
Mine, I think, is probably the awfulizing or catastrophizing. That if I can't, what's the point of doing this if there's no outlet for it in the immediate future, right? Mm-hmm. So, our brains are wired to, and our dopamine reward system is wired to put a higher value on things that are close, rewards that are closer versus mm-hmm. things in the distant mm-hmm. future. So it's trying to get out of the way of that model for me to start seeing, look, the routine is the reward, right? It's like you're getting into healthy habits, and think about being able to do things. And this is just coming off the back of a 31-day streak. I've got I'm so pleased with myself for getting through 31 days of doing this challenge. And rather than just immediately moving on to what the next goal is, just to let myself think,
be happy with it.
Yeah, that's a pretty good milestone for me. And it might not mean much in the life of you and the structure and the control you have of your life, but for me it does.
So basically, we've got a bottle of wine ready to be opened tonight. Is that the deal?
You don't drink.
Excellent. All right, well, I think we should sign off on that. Bottle of wine, here we come. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. And if you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe.
If you want to learn more, head over to XTERRAplanet.com. There you can register for your next off-road race, learn more about this podcast, and find some amazing gear. If you have questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@XTERRAplanet.com.
And if you're interested in learning more about how to master your brain for endurance sports, we've written a book.
It's called The Brave Athlete and is available everywhere they sell books.
And we even have an audiobook. In fact, we narrate it.
Yes, that's not exactly a great selling point.